Death at the Empty Tea Table. A Miss Marple Mystery. Chapter 1. The Body in the Garden. The morning mist had not yet lifted from the lawns of Rosemount when Ellen Hodges, who came in 3 days a week to do the Colonel's washing, found her employer dead among his tea things. She had let herself in by the garden gate, as she always did, calling out a cheerful good morning that went unanswered. It was not until she rounded the yew hedge that she saw him, Colonel Hugh Pemberton, seated in his wicker chair at the little table beneath the cedar tree, his chin fallen upon his chest, his hands still resting on the arms of the chair, as though he had merely dozed off in the sun. But the sun that morning was pale and reluctant, and no man dozed with such stillness. The table before him was laid with a full tea service, a Georgian silver pot, 3 cups of good Worcester china, a plate of untouched seed cake, and a small jug of milk gone slightly sour. 2 of the 3 cups were empty and clean, waiting. The Colonel's own cup, nearest his hand, was full to the brim, the tea within it long since gone cold. Ellen Hodges did not scream, being a sensible countrywoman not given to dramatics, but she did drop the wicker basket she carried, scattering clothes pegs across the gravel path, and she ran, as fast as her stout legs would carry her, to fetch Dr. Hale. By 9:30, the small close of Rosemount's garden had filled with the particular hush that attends sudden death in a quiet place. Constable Palk, standing rather importantly by the gate, Dr. Edmund Hale kneeling beside the wicker chair with his bag open on the grass, and, at the edge of the lawn, uninvited but somehow inevitable, the slight, white-haired figure of Miss Jane Marple, who had been walking to the vicarage with a basket of gooseberries when she heard the commotion and had, in her quiet way, simply come to see. "Hart," said Dr. Hale, rising and dusting off his knees. He was a youngish man, not more than 35, with a serious, watchful face that seemed older than his years. "I've suspected it for some time. He complained to me only last month of pains in the chest. A man of his age, living alone as he did, working himself up over that wretched business with his nephew, it isn't in the least surprising." "No signs of violence," Constable Palk agreed, writing laboriously in his notebook. "Seems clear enough, sir." It was at this point that Miss Marple, who had said nothing at all, made a small sound that nonetheless caused both men to look at her. "Such a pity," she said mildly. "About the tea." "The tea, Miss Marple." Dr. Hale's eyebrows rose. 3 cups, she said, and 2 of them clean. "I wonder who the Colonel was expecting. He never took tea alone, you know. He found it a melancholy habit. He told me so himself, quite forcefully, only last spring at the fete. He always said a solitary teapot was the saddest object in England." She paused, her pale blue eyes moving thoughtfully over the little table. "And there is a rose petal on the grass beside his chair. Just the one. I wonder where it came from." Constable Palk glanced down. There it was indeed, a single crimson petal, already curling at the edges, lying in the grass a few inches from the leg of the Colonel's chair. "Blown from a neighbour's garden, likely," said Palk, unmoved. "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, in the tone of one who does not for a moment believe it. "Though it is curious, because the Colonel never grew roses. He was most particular about it. He told me once that roses reminded him of a person he had known long ago, and that he could not abide the smell of them in his own garden. He grew only white lupins and delphiniums, you will notice, nothing at all with a scent to it." There was a small silence. Dr. Hale bent again over his patient, his fingers brushing the Colonel's still wrist, as though checking once more for a pulse he already knew was absent. "I don't think we need read too much into a stray petal, Miss Marple," he said, not unkindly. "The heart is a treacherous thing, especially in men who will not slow down as they ought. I shall write the certificate myself. There's no need to trouble the coroner with anything so straightforward." "Of course," said Miss Marple. "You would know far better than I, Doctor." But there was something in the mild, unhurried way she said it that made Constable Palk, at least, feel faintly uneasy, though he could not have said why. She stayed a little longer in the garden after the doctor had gone to telephone for the undertaker, walking slowly around the tea table, looking, though she could not herself have explained what she sought. The seed cake had been cut into 3 even slices, though only crumbs remained near the 3rd untouched place. Someone had begun to eat, then stopped, or someone had cut the cake and never come at all. Beneath the table, half hidden by the tablecloth's hem, lay a small folded card, the sort used for calling. She stooped, with some difficulty, for her knees were not what they had been, and picked it up. It was blank on both sides, save for a faint smear of what might have been garden soil, or might have been something else, pressed into one corner. 2 cups clean, she murmured to herself, tucking the card carefully into her cardigan pocket. 1 full and cold, a rose petal where no rose grows, and a guest who never came. She looked up at the cedar tree, its dark branches motionless in the still morning air, and her expression, usually so mild and vague, sharpened for a moment into something altogether more formidable. "How very interesting," said Miss Marple, and went to find the vicar's wife. For there is no one in an English village who knows more of its secrets than the woman who arranges the flowers. By noon the news had run the length of St. Mary Mead, like water finding its level, gathering embellishment as it went, so that by the time it reached the vicarage, where Miss Marple arrived, gooseberries still in hand, the colonel had died variously of a broken heart, a foreign poison smuggled home from his army days, and a curse laid upon Rosemount 40 years before. "Poor Colonel Pemberton," said Mrs. Harmon, setting down her scissors. "Such a solitary man, really, for all his bluff good humour. Do you know, Jane, I don't believe he ever had a single visitor to that house in all the years I've known him, except his nephew, and they were forever quarrelling." "That," said Miss Marple, settling herself into a chair with the particular stillness of a woman preparing to think very hard indeed, "is precisely what I find so interesting." Chapter 2. A Village in Whispers St. Mary. Mead had, over the years, developed a settled rhythm for the digestion of scandal, and by the following morning, the colonel's death had been thoroughly discussed over garden fences, in the queue at the fishmonger's, and at some length across the counter of the little shop that sold everything from bootlaces to barley sugar. Miss Marple, who made it her particular business to be present at as many of these small, unremarkable gatherings as possible, spent the morning with her knitting and her ears wide open. "A heart attack, they're saying," remarked Mrs. Price from behind the post office grill, sorting stamps with the air of a woman who did not believe her own words. "Though I always did think the colonel looked too red in the face to be healthy. All that port, if you ask me." "He'd given up port," said Miss Marple mildly. "Dr. Haydock told him to. 3 years ago now, after his last turn, he took nothing but China tea in the evenings. Very abstemious, really, for a military man." Mrs. Price looked faintly disappointed to have her theory contradicted, but rallied gamely. "Well, it was his heart all the same. Dr. Hale says so, and he ought to know, being the doctor and all. Though I did hear," she lowered her voice to the particular register reserved for the choicest morsels of gossip, "that the colonel was expecting company that very afternoon. Mrs. Carrow told my Ada as much when she came in for the stamps yesterday, before ever it was known he was dead. 2 guests to tea, she said, though who they might have been, Mrs. Carrow wouldn't say, or didn't know." This confirmed what Miss Marple had already surmised from the 3 cups, but she received it with an expression of mild surprise, as she found this generally encouraged people to say more than they had originally intended. "How very odd that no one came then," she said. "One does wonder what happened to them." "Frightened off by finding him dead? Like as not," said Mrs. Price, "and too shy to come forward and say so." It was, Miss Marple reflected as she walked on toward the vicarage, exactly the sort of explanation the village would settle upon if left to itself. Simple, unexciting, and almost certainly wrong. Truth, she had learned, was rarely so tidy, and those least willing to come forward were very often those with the most reason to keep silent. At the vicarage, she found Mrs. Harmon in the throes of the parish accounts, and glad of an excuse to abandon them. "I've been thinking about poor Colonel Pemberton," Miss Marple said, taking up a pair of secateurs to help with the flowers, as much for something to occupy her hands as for any love of gardening. "You knew him a good deal better than I did. Griselda, did he ever speak to you of his past? Before he came to St. Mary Mead, I mean." "He can only have been here, 12 years? 13, I think," said Mrs. Harmon, "though he never talked much of before. He was in India for years and years, and before that, I really couldn't say. He wasn't a man who cared to discuss himself, rather closed up about it all, if you want my opinion. My husband once asked him, quite innocently, about his family, and the Colonel changed the subject so quickly and so completely that Len never dared ask again." "How very interesting," murmured Miss Marple, snipping a stem of delphinium with rather more force than the task required. "And his nephew, Gerald, is it? I understand there was some unpleasantness there." "Oh, that's common knowledge," said Mrs. Harmon, sitting back on her heels among the flower baskets. "Gerald Pemberton's father, the Colonel's younger brother, Arthur, died in the war, and there was some sort of arrangement about the family land in Hampshire that never got properly settled. Gerald feels, or so I understand, that his uncle cheated his branch of the family out of what was rightfully theirs. He's been at the Colonel about it for years, writing letters, coming down for these frightful, awkward visits that always end in a row one can hear halfway down the lane. He was here again not a fortnight ago, and Ellen Hodges told me they were shouting so loudly at Rosemount that she nearly gave notice on the spot. And where is Gerald now, I wonder? In London, I believe, though he's certain to come down the moment he hears. He'll be wanting to know about the will, if I'm any judge of human nature, and I flatter myself that I am, a little, after 20 years in this parish." Miss Marple smiled at this, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the small folded card she had found beneath the tea-table, still tucked into her cardigan pocket. A calling card, blank and unmarked, the sort a solicitor or a stranger to the district might leave, if he called and found no one at home, or if he wished to announce himself before an appointment. 2 clean cups, a card with no name upon it, a visitor expected who never came, or who came and left again, before ever raising the knocker. "Griselda," she said, after a pause, "do you happen to know if the Colonel had dealings with a solicitor? Not old Mr. Petherbridge in the village. I mean someone from further afield. London, perhaps." Mrs. Harmon frowned, considering. "Now you mention it, I believe he did. There was a gentleman came to call on him, several weeks ago now. Very correct, very London, if you know what I mean by that. Ellen mentioned it, because he left his motor car blocking the lane, and old Mr. Blenkinsop from the hall had words with the chauffeur about it. I never heard the gentleman's name, though." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, setting down the secateurs. "No, I don't suppose you would have, but I think, Griselda, that I should very much like to find out." She left the vicarage a little before noon, her mind busy with the small, disparate facts she had gathered. A man who never grew roses, and yet died beside a rose petal. A man who never took tea alone, yet was found alone at a table laid for 3. A nephew nursing an old grievance. A London solicitor, whose business at Rosemount no one could quite explain. Taken singly, each fact seemed no more significant than a stray thread. But murder, Miss Marple had long understood, very rarely announced itself in a single dramatic gesture. It was, far more often, a pattern woven from a great many small threads, each innocent enough alone, until someone with sufficient patience traced them all to their single, terrible knot. She had every intention of being that someone. Chapter 3. The Housekeeper's Secret Rosemount. When Miss Marple called upon it 2 days later, ostensibly to return a book of sermons the colonel had lent the vicarage, wore the particular hush of a house whose master has died and whose future is, as yet, undecided. Vivienne Carrow answered the door herself, there being no other servant kept at Rosemount besides Ellen Hodges for the rough work. She was a woman of perhaps 28, dark-haired and quick-eyed, with the sort of controlled composure that Miss Marple recognized at once as the particular discipline of a person holding herself very carefully together. "Miss Marple." Her voice was pleasant, well modulated, not a country voice, though Miss Marple could not have said precisely why she thought so. "I'm afraid the house is rather at 6s and 7s. Won't you come in all the same?" The sitting room at Rosemount was a bachelor's room, comfortable and a little shabby, with regimental photographs on the mantelpiece and a smell of pipe tobacco lingering in the curtains, as though reluctant to accept its owner would not return. Miss Marple settled herself in the chair indicated and accepted, with every appearance of gratitude, a cup of tea she did not particularly want. "You've been with the colonel some years now, I believe," she said, when the small courtesies had been observed. 6 years. Mrs. Carrow's hands, Miss Marple noticed, were perfectly steady as she poured, though there was a tightness about her mouth that spoke of considerable strain, carefully mastered. He was a good employer, difficult sometimes, set in his ways, as bachelors of his age generally are, but fair. It must be a very great shock to you. And such an uncertain time, I should imagine, not knowing what is to become of the household. Mr. Petherbridge, the colonel's solicitor here in the village, has been very kind about it. He says I may stay on until matters are settled, whatever that turns out to mean. A small, brittle laugh. "I try not to think too far ahead, Miss Marple. It doesn't do." Miss Marple sipped her tea and allowed a silence to develop, a technique perfected over many years, more productive, she had found, than direct questioning. People found silence uncomfortable and would often fill it with confidences they had not intended to share. Sure enough, after a moment, Mrs. Carrow set down her own cup with a small, decisive click. "I don't suppose it matters now, who knows," she said. "But I may as well tell you before you hear it from someone else, distorted out of all recognition. I'm engaged to be married to Thomas Reeve, who has the nursery gardens on the Much Benham Road." The colonel didn't know, or rather, he did know, and he disapproved most heartily, and there was rather a scene about it only last week. Indeed, Miss Marple's tone remained mild, but her attention had sharpened considerably. "May I ask why he should disapprove? Mr. Reeve seems, from what little I know of him, a thoroughly respectable young man." "He is, but the colonel had some notion. I never fully understood it, and he wouldn't explain that Thomas's family was not to be trusted. He said something once about the Reeves having done him a disservice years ago, long before Thomas was even born, I should think, since Thomas is only 31. I put it down to an old man's prejudice and thought no more of it, until the colonel told me flatly that if I married Thomas Reeve, I need not expect to remain in his employ, nor to be remembered in his will. Not that I ever expected to be remembered in his will, you understand. But he said it as though it were a genuine threat, as though he thought the money mattered to me more than Thomas did." Her chin lifted. "It doesn't. But it made for a very unpleasant fortnight, and I won't pretend I'm sorry. The subject need not come up again." It was, Miss Marple reflected, a remarkably candid admission for a woman speaking to a comparative stranger, and either spoke very well for Mrs. Carrow's honesty or very cleverly for her nerve. She had learned over the years not to assume it was always the former. "Were you here, in the house, on the afternoon the colonel died?" she asked, in the same mild tone she might have used to ask about the weather. "I was in the village until nearly 5, said Mrs. Carrow, without hesitation. "I'd gone to collect a parcel of wool from the post office. I'm knitting a jersey, if you can believe anyone still has the patience for it. And I stopped to speak with Mrs. Price for a good 20 minutes, as she'll tell you herself, I'm sure, since she does love to talk. When I came back, it was gone 4:30, and I found the tea things laid out in the garden exactly as the Colonel had asked me to lay them that morning, before I left. He asked you to lay tea for 3 then, himself and 2 others. For the first time, something flickered across Mrs. Carrow's controlled features. Not quite alarm, but something close to it, quickly suppressed. Yes, he was very particular about it. The good china, he said, and the silver pot, not the everyday one. I asked who was expected, and he only said, someone I should have seen a long time ago, which struck me as a strange sort of answer, but the Colonel was often strange in his answers, and I didn't press him. And you have no idea at all who this someone might have been? None whatever. But Mrs. Carrow's eyes had slid, for just a fraction of a second, toward the window that looked out over the garden, toward the cedar tree and the little table beneath it, still standing where it had stood on the morning of the Colonel's death, no one in the household having found the heart, apparently, to clear it away. I've wondered myself, Miss Marple, more than I like to admit, because whoever it was, they never came, and I can't help feeling that if they had come, the Colonel might still be alive. It was, Miss Marple thought, as she walked home along the lane a little later, an interesting choice of words. Not, the Colonel would not have died alone, which would have been the natural thing to say, but the Colonel might still be alive, which suggested a rather more specific and troubling train of thought than Mrs. Carrow had perhaps intended to reveal. She added it carefully to the small store of facts she was gathering, and found herself wondering, not for the first time, precisely what old grievance lay buried in the Colonel's insistence that the Reeve family had done him a disservice so many years before that his housekeeper's own fiancé could not have been born to commit it. Chapter 4. Old Grudges, Older Wounds. Gerald Pemberton arrived in St. Mary Mead on the Thursday afternoon train, and by Thursday evening had contrived to make himself thoroughly disliked at the Blue Boar, where he took a room, by complaining loudly about the quality of the whisky and the slowness of the service. Miss Marple, who heard of this within the hour from Mrs. Price's niece, who did the chambermaiding at the Blue Boar on alternate days, thought it worth calling upon him the following morning under the pretext of offering the villagers condolences. She found him in the small residence lounge, a tall, fair young man of perhaps 35, with his uncle's straight nose, but none of his weathered good humour, reading a letter with an expression of irritation. "Miss Marple, is it?" He rose, not ungraciously, when the landlady introduced her. "You knew my uncle, I gather. Everyone in this village seems to have known my uncle rather better than I did, which I find a curious state of affairs, all things considered, since I am his only living relative. The village is a small world, Mr. Pemberton, and the Colonel had lived here a good many years. It must be very hard for you, coming down under such circumstances." "Hard?" He gave a short, unamused laugh and gestured her to a chair. "I won't pretend to you what I wouldn't pretend to anyone else. My uncle and I were not on the best of terms, hadn't been for years. He believed I resented him, and he was quite right. I did, and do still, though it seems a poor sort of thing to admit with the man not yet in his grave. The matter of the Hampshire property, I understand." His eyebrows rose. "You are well informed." "Yes, the Hampshire property. My father died at Dunkirk, Miss Marple, along with a great many better men, and left my mother and myself very poorly provided for, because the family estate passed entire to my uncle under the terms of my grandfather's will, an arrangement my uncle could perfectly well have altered, and did not, though he had money enough and to spare, and no children of his own to provide for. I have asked him more than once, and not always civilly, I confess, to do something for us. He always refused, said my father had made his own choices and I must make mine, and that charity, handed out under duress, was worth nothing to giver or receiver alike. Very fine sentiments from a man sitting on £40,000 and a house in the country. You saw him recently, I believe, a fortnight or so before he died. I did, and we quarrelled, if that's what you're leading up to, and no doubt half the village heard us do it, since my uncle never learned to keep his voice down in his life. He said this with a bitter frankness that Miss Marple found, on balance, more convincing of innocence than a more careful denial would have been, though she reminded herself, as she always did, that the guilty were not infrequently the most frank of all, having calculated that frankness would serve them better than concealment. May I ask what the quarrel concerned, specifically? The usual thing, money. But there was something else, that time, something that surprised me rather, and I'll admit, I've thought about it since. Gerald Pemberton frowned, turning his glass of whiskey slowly on the table before him. He told me he was thinking of making a new will. Said he'd been in touch with a London solicitor, not old Petherbridge, who's handled his affairs here for years, but someone new, from a firm in Lincoln's Inn, and that certain matters needed setting straight before he died. He wouldn't tell me what he meant by it, and when I pressed him, he as good as ordered me out of the house. I came away thinking he meant to cut me out of what little I might have expected altogether, and I'll confess I went back to London in something of a temper. Did he give any indication, Miss Marple asked carefully, of who else might benefit, if not yourself? None. But I'll tell you this, Miss Marple, since you seem to want telling, there was a woman's name I heard him mutter, once, when he thought I'd already left the room. Ashworth. I didn't think anything of it at the time. I do now. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, turning the name over in her mind as though testing its weight. Ashworth. It meant nothing to her directly, and yet something in the way it had been said, dropped almost carelessly into the conversation, and yet clearly troubling to the young man who repeated it, suggested it was a thread worth following. You were in London on the afternoon he died, I take it? I was at my club until past 6, as a dozen men can tell you, and I don't in the least mind you checking, Miss Marple, because I imagine that's precisely what you intend to do. He looked at her then with a flicker of something that might have been reluctant respect. You're not quite what you appear to be, are you? The vicar's wife told me you were a harmless old lady who liked her garden and her gossip. I begin to think she rather undersold you. I am a harmless old lady who likes her garden and her gossip, said Miss Marple placidly. It is only that gossip, properly attended to, has a way of turning out to be a good deal more than idle chatter. Tell me, Mr. Pemberton, does the name Reeve mean anything to you, or the name Delia? Something crossed his face, a flicker of memory, quickly suppressed. Delia, he repeated slowly. Now that you mention it, yes, I believe I've heard my uncle say that name too, though I couldn't tell you when or in what connection. It was a long time ago, before the war, I should think, from the way he said it, as a man speaks of something that belongs to a much younger version of himself. He shook his head. I'm afraid I can't help you further than that, Miss Marple. My uncle was not a man who invited confidences, from me least of all. Miss Marple thanked him and took her leave, walking back through the village with the pleasant, unhurried air of a woman with nothing more pressing on her mind than the state of her delphiniums, though in truth, her thoughts were racing along a quite different track altogether. Ashworth, Delia, a London solicitor, and a new will. A rose petal beside a dead man's chair, though he grew no roses of his own. The threads, she felt, were beginning, very faintly, very tentatively, to draw together, though what pattern they would ultimately form, she could not yet say. She resolved, before the day was out, to pay a call upon old Mr. Petherbridge, who had, after all, been the Colonel's solicitor for the better part of 20 years, and who might reasonably be expected to know a good deal more about his client's private history than he had so far chosen to share with the village at large. Chapter 5. The Uninvited Guest. Mr. Petherbridge's office occupied the ground floor of a narrow, ivy-covered house in the High Street, and had changed nothing of its furnishings in the 30 years Miss Marple had known it. The same dusty deed boxes, the same smell of sealing wax and old paper, the same brass-shaded lamp casting its yellow pool across a desk buried in documents. "Miss Marple." The old solicitor rose to greet her with the careful courtesy of a man who regarded even the most innocent social call with a faint, ingrained caution. "A sad business, this, about the Colonel. A very sad business. Very sad indeed, Mr. Petherbridge. I wonder if I might trouble you with a question or two. Not, of course, if it would compromise any professional confidence. I should never wish to ask that of you." "You may ask," said Mr. Petherbridge, settling back into his chair with the air of a man who reserved the right not to answer, "and I shall tell you what I properly can. I understand the Colonel had recently been in correspondence with a solicitor in London, someone from Lincoln's Inn, rather than yourself. I wondered if you might know anything of the matter." To her mild surprise, Mr. Petherbridge did not immediately retreat into professional reticence, but instead sighed and removed his spectacles, polishing them slowly on his handkerchief. A gesture, Miss Marple had long ago learned, that generally preceded a confidence he had been debating whether to share. "I may as well tell you, since it will all come out at the inquest in any case, and I'd rather it came from me in an orderly fashion than from village gossip in a disorderly one. Yes, the Colonel had engaged a Mr. Wendell Ashcroft, of Ashcroft and Fen, to draw up a new will. He informed me of this himself some 3 weeks ago, with rather more embarrassment than I'd have expected from a man of his usual bluntness. Said it was a delicate family matter he preferred to keep from local knowledge, and that he hoped I would not take it as any reflection on our long association. I told him, quite truthfully, that I took no offence whatsoever, and asked no further questions, which is, I find, generally the wisest course in matters of this kind. "And do you know," Miss Marple asked, very quietly, "what became of Mr. Ashcroft's visit? For I understand he was expected at Rosemount on the very afternoon the Colonel died, and that he never arrived." Mr. Petherbridge looked genuinely startled. "I did not know that, Miss Marple, though I confess it does not entirely surprise me. I had a telephone call, only yesterday, from Ashcroft's clerk, asking rather anxiously whether I had any knowledge of the Colonel's death, since Mr. Ashcroft himself had gone down to St. Mary Mead on the appointed day and had not been seen or heard from since." Miss Marple sat very still. "Not been seen or heard from," she repeated slowly. "Do you mean, Mr. Petherbridge, that the solicitor himself is missing?" "I mean precisely that. His clerk is most distressed about it, and has, I understand, already been in touch with the county police. Mr. Ashcroft's motor car was found abandoned on the Much Benham Road, some 2 miles outside the village, on the evening of the Colonel's death. The engine cold, the doors unlocked, and no sign whatever of the gentleman himself." This was news indeed, and Miss Marple turned it over carefully before speaking again. "The Much Benham Road," she said thoughtfully. "That would take him past the Reeve Nursery Gardens, would it not, on his way into the village?" "It would, though I can't imagine what bearing that has on the matter." "Nor can I, as yet," Miss Marple admitted, "though I have found, over the years, that when two apparently unconnected facts occur upon the same road at the same hour, it is generally worth asking whether they are quite so unconnected as they at first appear. Tell me, Mr. Petherbridge, do you know anything of the new will's provisions? I ask only because it seems to me that whoever stood to gain, or to lose, by its contents, might have had a very particular interest in ensuring that Mr. Ashcroft never reached Rosemount to have it properly witnessed and signed." "I know nothing of its contents," said the old solicitor, with the finality of a man closing a ledger. "And if I did, Miss Marple, I should not tell you, professional confidence extending as it must, even beyond the grave. I will say only this, and it is no great secret, since the Colonel mentioned it to me himself in a moment of unusual candour, that he told me the new will concerned a debt of honour, long overdue, and that he wished to discharge it before he died. He would say no more, save that it concerned no one presently living in this village, and that he trusted it would cause no scandal once the matter was properly settled. A debt of honor, long overdue, Miss Marple echoed softly. And a name I have heard twice now in connection with the Colonel's past. Ashworth. Does that name mean anything to you, Mr. Petherbridge? The solicitor's carefully neutral expression flickered, just for an instant, into something Miss Marple could not quite read. Surprise, certainly, but perhaps also a species of recognition, hastily suppressed. I could not say, he said too quickly, and reached for a paper on his desk, in the manner of a man signaling that the interview was at an end. I really could not say, Miss Marple. You must forgive me. I have a great deal of business to attend to this morning. She left his office a few minutes later, walking slowly back along the high street, with her basket over her arm, aware that Mr. Petherbridge had told her a good deal more, in his evasions, than he would ever have admitted in plain speech. A missing solicitor! An abandoned motor car on the Much Benham Road, within sight, or very nearly, of Thomas Reeves' nursery gardens. A new will, concerning a debt of honor, and a name that made even the most discreet of solicitors flinch. It was, Miss Marple reflected, becoming an increasingly serious matter, and one that she rather thought Inspector Slack, when at last he condescended to take an interest in it, would find considerably less straightforward than a simple failure of an old man's heart. Chapter 6. Roses That Never Bloomed. Thomas Reeves' nursery gardens lay a little more than a mile outside the village, on the Much Benham Road, a scatter of glass houses and cold frames that had been in his family, Miss Marple understood, for the better part of 60 years. She found him among the rose beds on Saturday morning, a broad-shouldered, sun-browned young man of 31, kneeling in the black earth with an expression of complete absorption that he did not immediately abandon on her approach. Miss Marple. He rose, wiping his hands on his corduroys, when at last he noticed her at the end of the row. He come to look at the roses. I've a fine show of Madame Caroline Test out this year, if you're interested, though I understand from Vivienne you've heard about us, and I don't suppose roses are really what's brought you out this morning. You are very direct, Mr. Reeve. No sense in being otherwise. The whole village knows Vivienne and I are engaged, and that the Colonel didn't approve, and I'd rather have it out plainly than have you circling round it for half an hour. He said this without hostility, in the manner of a man who found evasion more tiresome than uncomfortable truth. Very well then, plainly, said Miss Marple, seating herself on the low wall that bordered the rose bed. The Colonel objected to your engagement on the grounds that your family had done him a disservice many years before you were born. Do you know what he meant by that? Thomas Reeves' face, which had been open and faintly amused, closed over rather suddenly. I know something of it, he said, after a pause. Not from the Colonel. He never spoke to me directly in his life, beyond ordering plants for his garden, which he did every spring with great regularity and no apparent pleasure. I had it from my father, before he died. It seems my grandfather worked these same gardens back before the First War and grew roses for half the great houses in the county, including, so my father told me, for a young lady named Delia Ashworth, who lived at the Grange in those days, and who was, by all accounts, a very great beauty. Miss Marple sat very still. And what became of Miss Ashworth? That's rather the trouble, isn't it? Nobody in the village will say quite, though everyone over 60 seems to know something of it. My father told me only that there was some scandal, back before the First War, that Colonel Pemberton, who was a young officer then, newly commissioned and very much in love, courted Delia Ashworth for the better part of 2 years, and that something went badly wrong between them, very suddenly, and she left the district and was never spoken of again in polite company. My grandfather, so my father said, was drawn into it somehow, carried messages between them, I believe, being a discreet sort of man, and trusted by both families, and was blamed, afterward, by the Colonel, for some part he'd played in the business. I never fully understood what, and my father claimed not to know either, though I've always suspected he knew a good deal more than he ever told me. A very great beauty, and a scandal, and a young officer very much in love, Miss Marple repeated softly. Do you know, Mr. Reeve, whether Miss Ashworth is still living? I couldn't tell you. I'd assumed, if I thought of it at all, that she must have died years ago, or married and moved away under a different name. It's ancient history, Miss Marple. Before my time, before Vivian's time, before nearly anyone's time who's still living in this village. I can't see what it has to do with the Colonel dying of a heart attack in his own garden. Perhaps nothing, Miss Marple agreed, though her tone suggested she believed nothing of the sort. Tell me one more thing, Mr. Reeve, if you would be so kind. Do you grow foxgloves here, among your other plants? The question, coming as it did without any apparent connection to what had gone before, seemed to catch him off guard. Foxgloves? Yes, a good bed of them, along the north wall there, though I don't sell many. They're not much wanted for cutting, being poisonous, as I dare say you know. Why do you ask? Idle curiosity, said Miss Marple, in the tone of a woman who was very rarely idle, and never merely curious. And were you on this road, Mr. Reeve, on the afternoon the Colonel died? I understand a motor car was found abandoned not far from here, belonging, it seems, to a London solicitor who never reached Rosemount at all. Thomas Reeve's easy manner deserted him entirely for a moment, and Miss Marple watched, with great interest, as something like genuine alarm crossed his weathered features. I heard about the motor car, he said carefully. Constable Palk was round asking questions about it only yesterday. I told him what I'll tell you. I was in the glass houses all that afternoon, potting cuttings, and saw no motor car and no gentleman from London, and I'd be glad if the whole village would stop looking at me as though I know more about it than I do, because I don't, Miss Marple, and that's the plain truth of it. I never suggested you did, said Miss Marple mildly, rising from the wall and brushing down her skirt. I only asked whether you were here. You have answered me very fully, Mr. Reeve, and I am obliged to you. She paused at the gate, looking back at him over her shoulder, with an expression of perfect, guileless mildness that did not, in the least, match the sharpness of her next question. One more small thing. Did your grandfather, by any chance, ever mention what became of the child? The colour drained visibly from Thomas Reeve's face. I don't know what you mean, he said, too quickly, in almost exactly the tone Mr. Petherbridge had used 2 days before. No, said Miss Marple gently. No, I rather thought you might not. But I think, Mr. Reeve, that somebody in this village knows a very great deal more about Delia Ashworth than has yet been said aloud, and I begin to suspect that the answer to poor Colonel Pemberton's death lies not in this present summer at all, but in a garden very like this one, more than 30 years ago. She left him standing among his roses, his secateurs forgotten in his hand, and walked back toward the village with the unhurried step of a woman who had, that morning, learned considerably more than she had expected to, and who now had a great deal of quiet thinking to do. Chapter 7. A Woman from the Past. It took Miss Marple the better part of 2 days, and a great many carefully worded letters to old friends, scattered across 3 counties, to run Delia Ashworth to ground. A task made no easier by the discovery that the lady had, in the intervening 30 years, married and been widowed, and now lived under the name of Mrs. Delia Fenwick in a small cottage on the outskirts of Much Benham, scarcely 4 miles from St. Mary Mead. 4 miles, Miss Marple murmured to herself, when the information at last reached her through the good offices of her old friend Miss Cartwright, who had once served on a hospital committee with Mrs. Fenwick, and remembered her, vaguely, as rather a sad, quiet sort of woman, very devoted to her garden. 4 miles was no distance at all. A woman might cycle it in half an hour, or take the local bus that ran twice daily along the Much Benham Road, passing, as it happened, within sight of both the Reeve nursery and the spot where Mr. Ashcroft's motor car had been found abandoned. Mrs. Fenwick's cottage, when Miss Marple called upon it on the pretext of a shared interest in the Much Benham Horticultural Society, proved to be small and neat and surrounded by a garden given over almost entirely to roses, dozens of them, of every shade, from palest cream to deepest crimson, tended with the particular devotion of a woman who has, perhaps, very little else to occupy her heart. Mrs. Fenwick herself was a slight, silver-haired woman of some 60 years, with the faded remains of what had once, unmistakably, been considerable beauty, and eyes that held a watchfulness Miss Marple recognized at once, having seen something very like it in her own mirror on occasion. "You've not come about the Horticultural Society at all, have you, Miss Marple?" she said, after the tea had been poured, in the tone of a woman too weary of pretense to maintain it further. "You've come about Hugh Pemberton." Miss Marple, who had not expected quite such directness, set down her cup carefully. "I have. I hope you will forgive the intrusion. I understand you knew the Colonel a very long time ago. I knew him before he was a colonel, before he was anything at all but a young lieutenant, with more charm than sense, and I was foolish enough to love him for it." Mrs. Fenwick's voice was quite steady, but her hands, Miss Marple noticed, had gone very still in her lap. "I have been waiting for someone to come, you know, ever since I read of his death in the county paper. I rather thought it might be the police. I find I am almost relieved it is only you. May I ask what happened between you? I have heard only fragments, a scandal, a broken engagement, a family sent away." "You have heard the polite version, then, which is more than I generally receive." Mrs. Fenwick rose and walked to the window, looking out over her roses with an expression Miss Marple could not quite read. "I was 21, Miss Marple, and very much in love, and very foolish, as young women in love generally are. Hugh Pemberton and I were to be married, it was all but announced, and then I found myself with child, some months before the wedding could decently take place. In those days, you understand, such a thing was not merely embarrassing, it was ruinous." Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were very kind, and Mrs. Fenwick, perhaps encouraged by this, continued. "Hugh's mother, a most formidable woman, dead these 30 years now, was appalled at the prospect of a scandal touching the family name. She persuaded Hugh, or perhaps bullied him, that marriage under such circumstances would ruin his career and disgrace them both. He was sent abroad with his regiment within the month. I was sent away to an aunt in the north, and the child, when it came, was given for adoption through a private arrangement. A respectable childless couple, I was told, and I was never permitted to know their name, nor to see the child again. And old Mr. Reeve," Miss Marple said gently, "carried messages between you and the Colonel before all this happened." Mrs. Fenwick turned from the window, genuine surprise crossing her face. "You know a great deal, Miss Marple." "Yes, John Reeve, Thomas's grandfather, was our go-between. In the early days, when Hugh's family disapproved of the match, on grounds of my own modest fortune, long before the real trouble began. He was a kind man and discreet, and Hugh's mother blamed him bitterly afterward for having encouraged the courtship at all, though it was scarcely his doing. I believe Hugh himself never forgave the Reeve family either, in some confused, unjust way, as though a man who had merely carried letters between two young people in love could somehow be held responsible for what came after. Did you ever hear from the Colonel again in all these years?" "Not until 6 weeks ago." Mrs. Fenwick's voice caught, very slightly. "He wrote to me, a strange, stiff letter, quite unlike the boy I remembered, though I suppose 30 years changes any of us past recognition. He said he was dying. His heart, he told me, though I gather now that may not have been strictly true, and that he wished to set right, before the end, a wrong he had carried on his conscience for the whole of his life. He asked whether I knew what had become of our child. I did not, Miss Marple. I have never known. He said he intended to find out, and that if the child could be found, he meant to acknowledge it properly in his will, whatever scandal might come of it at this late hour. He said he no longer cared in the least for scandal, only for making what amends he still could. And did he find the child, do you know? He wrote again, only a fortnight ago, in great excitement. Said he had found what he was looking for, closer to home than he had ever imagined, and meant to arrange a proper reunion, once he had consulted his London solicitor about the necessary legal changes. He asked me to come to tea, Miss Marple, on the very afternoon he died, to meet, at long last, the son we had given away 30 years before. Her composure broke at last, and she pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. I lost my courage at the last moment, and telephoned to say I could not come, that I would come another day when I felt stronger. I have never forgiven myself for it. If I had gone, perhaps nothing would have been different at all, Miss Marple said gently, though privately she was not at all certain this was true. Mrs. Fenwick, did the Colonel tell you, in that last letter, who your son had become, where he might be found? Mrs. Fenwick shook her head. He said only that I would be surprised, that our son had, by the strangest chance in the world, come to live and work within a few miles of Rosemount itself, without either of them knowing it until very recently. He said he meant to tell me the whole story over tea, properly, as it deserved to be told. She looked up, her eyes red but steady. He is somewhere in this district, Miss Marple. My son, a grown man of 30, who does not know I exist, walking about these lanes and villages, and I have not the faintest idea which of the faces I pass in the street might be his. Miss Marple, walking home that evening in the long golden light, found her thoughts returning, again and again, to a face she had seen only 2 days before, watchful, serious, older than its years, bending over a dead man in a garden and pronouncing, with just a fraction too much haste, the comfortable verdict of a failing heart. Chapter 8. The Doctor's Hesitation. Dr. Edmund Hale had come to St. Mary Mead some 4 years before, buying the small practice from old Dr. Haydock, and had, in the intervening time, made himself generally liked, if not generally known. He kept somewhat apart from village society, attended church without ever quite joining the warm circle that gathered afterward, dined alone at the Blue Boar, and had, so far as anyone could recall, no family connections in the district, having come, he said, from a practice in the north of England before that. Miss Marple called upon him on the Monday morning on the pretext of a troublesome twinge in her shoulder, and found him at the end of a short row of patients, looking rather more tired than the mild demands of a country practice ought reasonably to produce. "Rheumatism, I should think, Miss Marple, at your time of life," he said, after a brief and perfunctory examination. "Nothing to be greatly alarmed about. I'll write you something for it." "Thank you, Dr. Hale. It is very good of you to see me, when I know you must be so dreadfully busy with poor Colonel Pemberton's affairs." Something in his manner, which had been briskly professional, tightened almost imperceptibly. "There's little enough for me to do there, beyond the certificate. The undertaker has the rest of it in hand." "I only wondered," Miss Marple said, settling herself more comfortably in the chair opposite his desk, in a manner that suggested she had no intention of leaving in the immediate future, whether the inquest would require you to give evidence. "I understand from Constable Palk that the coroner has, after all, decided to hold one, given the circumstances." She let the word hang delicately, watching him. "A formality," said Dr. Hale, a shade too quickly. "The circumstances, as you call them, amount to no more than an elderly man's overworked heart giving out under strain. And he had been under a very great deal of strain lately, Miss Marple, whatever the gossip in this village may prefer to believe. Family quarrels, business worries, a solicitor's visit that never came off. Any one of those might account for it, without any need to look further." "You knew, then, about the solicitor's visit? The whole village knows about it now, I imagine, thanks to Mrs. Price and her telephone." He said this with a flash of something that might have been irritation, quickly mastered. Miss Marple, if I may speak plainly, I understand you have been asking a good many questions about the Colonel's death, all around the village. I don't doubt your motives are entirely well-meaning. But I would ask you to consider that a man does not need to have been murdered for his death to be a tragedy, and that stirring up old scandals in pursuit of a mystery that very likely does not exist can cause a great deal of pain to people who have already suffered enough. That is very sound advice, Miss Marple agreed placidly. And I should certainly take it, Dr. Hale, if I believed for a single moment that no mystery existed. But you see, I have found rather too many small, unexplained things lying about for my own peace of mind. A rose petal beside a man who grew no roses. A solicitor who vanished from the face of the earth on his way to a tea party. A new will concerning what the Colonel himself called a debt of honor, long overdue. And a woman named Delia Ashworth, who gave up a child more than 30 years ago that she has never been permitted to know. She watched him very closely as she said this, and was rewarded, though she took no particular pleasure in it, by the sight of Dr. Hale going very still indeed, his pen motionless above the prescription pad, his face, for just a moment, entirely without its careful professional composure. "I don't see," he said, after a pause that lasted a fraction too long, "what any of that has to do with a simple heart attack." "Perhaps nothing at all," said Miss Marple, rising and gathering up her gloves with every appearance of having concluded a perfectly ordinary consultation. "It is only that I find myself wondering, Dr. Hale, how a doctor could be so entirely certain of heart failure in a man he had examined only briefly and hurriedly in his own garden, without troubling to wait for the results of a proper post-mortem examination, particularly when that doctor is, I understand, generally so very careful and thorough in all his other work. Dr. Haydock always said you were the most conscientious young man he'd ever handed a practice to. It seems almost out of character, does it not, that you should be satisfied so quickly in a case of such very sudden and unexpected death." There was a long silence, during which Dr. Hale's face underwent a curious series of transformations, from alarm to something that might almost have been relief, and finally to a kind of weary resignation that Miss Marple found, on the whole, considerably more informative than any of the careful denials that had gone before. "You are a very perceptive woman, Miss Marple," he said at last, quietly. "More perceptive, I think, than is entirely comfortable for the rest of us. I will tell you this much, and no more, until I have had time to consider my position properly. I did not kill Hugh Pemberton. But I will admit to you that I had reason, when I examined him, to suspect his death was not so simple as I chose to record it, and that I said nothing of my suspicions to Constable Palk, out of motives I am not yet prepared to discuss with you or with anyone else." "That," said Miss Marple, pausing at the door with her hand upon the handle, "is very nearly an admission of a very serious matter, Dr. Hale, and I think you know it. I do not for a moment suppose you administered whatever it was that killed him. A doctor bent on murder would hardly leave so many curious little threads lying about for an old woman to pull at. But a man who conceals evidence of foul play, for reasons of his own, however sympathetic those reasons may eventually prove to be, places himself in a very dangerous position indeed, both with the law and, I should think, with whoever it was that truly wished the Colonel dead, and who may not take kindly to a doctor whose silence cannot, after all, be relied upon forever." She left him sitting very still behind his desk, the prescription for her rheumatism forgotten and unwritten, and walked home slowly in the warm afternoon sunshine, turning over in her mind the strange, watchful resemblance she had noticed, now that she came to look for it directly, between Dr. Edmund Hale's serious dark eyes and the faded, still beautiful eyes of Mrs. Delia Fenwick, weeping in her cottage garden among the roses she had spent 30 years tending in place of the child she had never been allowed to keep. Chapter 9. Tea and Threats. It was on the Tuesday evening that Miss Marple found the note pushed beneath her cottage door. A single sheet of plain paper, The message, composed of words cut crudely from a newspaper and pasted in uneven lines. "Leave the past buried, or you will join the Colonel." She read it twice, with more interest than alarm, and then did what she always did, with evidence of any kind. She sat down with a cup of tea and considered it very carefully. The paper was ordinary, sold in every stationer's in the county. The newspaper from which the letters had been cut was the Much Benham Gazette, rather than the local paper, a small detail narrowing the field of who might plausibly have had a copy to hand. And the note had been pushed under her door sometime between 6, when she returned from evensong, and 8, when she noticed it lying on the mat. Whoever left it knew both her habits and her whereabouts with some precision, which meant, in a village this size, very nearly everyone she had so far spoken to. She telephoned Constable Palk, more from a sense of proper procedure than from any expectation that the note would yield useful evidence. And then, rather more urgently, she telephoned Mrs. Fenwick's cottage in Much Benham, seized by a sudden and specific anxiety she could not entirely rationalize. There was no answer. Miss Marple did not, as a rule, allow herself dramatic gestures, but she put on her coat at once and walked to the vicarage to borrow the Harmons motor car, explaining only that she had urgent business in Much Benham. She found Mrs. Fenwick's cottage dark, and, at first, alarming glance, empty, until a light showed at the back, and Mrs. Fenwick herself opened the door, pale but unharmed, a poker held rather incongruously in one hand. "Miss Marple, I heard someone in the garden not 20 minutes ago, among the roses, if you can believe it, at this hour. And when I went to the window, I saw a man's shape, though I couldn't tell you who. He was gone before I could get the door open. I've been sitting here ever since, working up the courage to telephone the police, and feeling exceedingly foolish about it." "You are not in the least foolish," said Miss Marple firmly, coming inside and bolting the door behind her. "I think, Mrs. Fenwick, that someone in this affair has grown very frightened indeed, and frightened people are dangerous people. I had a note myself this evening, warning me to leave the past buried." She held it out. Mrs. Fenwick read it and went very white. "Then it's true. Someone did kill Hugh, and they mean to stop at nothing to keep it hidden." "I begin to think so," Miss Marple agreed, "though I am still not entirely certain who. But I notice, Mrs. Fenwick, that whoever came to your garden tonight came for roses, or came near them, in a manner that seems to me neither accidental nor idle. I wonder very much whether he took one away with him, as he did, I think, once before, from a garden very like this, to leave beside a dead man's chair." They searched the rose-bed together by torchlight and found, near the gate, a single broken stem, where a bloom had been cut cleanly away. The same variety, Mrs. Fenwick confirmed with a shudder, as the flowers she had always, in the old days, worn pinned to her dress when Hugh Pemberton came calling, 30 years before. "Someone who knew that," Miss Marple said slowly, "and who knew it well enough to use it as a kind of signature. A private message, meant, I think, for you and the Colonel both, though only one of you was left alive to receive it." "That is a very particular and personal kind of cruelty, Mrs. Fenwick, and it tells me a great deal about the sort of person we are looking for. Not a stranger, not even, I think, a comparative newcomer like Dr. Hale or Mrs. Carrow. Someone who has known this whole sad history for a very long time indeed, long enough to have carried some grievance of his own within it, all these years, without any of us suspecting it. She stayed with Mrs. Fenwick until Constable Palk arrived from Much Benham, summoned by telephone, to take a statement and post a man to watch the cottage through the night. It was very late by the time Miss Marple returned to her own bed, but she lay awake a good while longer, turning over in her mind the small, precise cruelty of a rose cut cleanly from its stem and carried away as a trophy, and the growing, uncomfortable certainty that the person responsible was someone who had, from the very beginning of her inquiries, presented himself to her as helpful, discreet, and entirely above suspicion. It was not until nearly 2 in the morning, as she drifted at last towards sleep, that a single fragment of memory surfaced, unbidden, from some deep and well-organized corner of her mind. A case from years before, concerning a country solicitor and a sum of trust money that had never quite added up. And Miss Marple sat bolt upright in the darkness, entirely awake once more, with the beginnings of an idea that she did not, even to herself, quite dare to put into words until she had proof to support it. Chapter 10. The Parallel of the Past. The memory that had woken Miss Marple so abruptly concerned an affair from some 25 years before in a village not 30 miles from St. Mary Mead, where a respected local solicitor had been discovered, after his death, to have quietly diverted the greater part of a trust fund left for an orphaned child, replacing the true accounts with false ones so skillfully the fraud had gone undetected for 2 decades. It came to light only by accident, and the solicitor being conveniently dead, the matter was hushed up for the sake of the firm's remaining clients. Miss Marple had never forgotten the case, chiefly because she had been struck, at the time, by how very ordinary and trustworthy the solicitor in question had appeared to everyone who knew him. A pillar of his community, a churchwarden, a man to whom half the village entrusted their most private affairs without a second thought. It was, she reflected now, precisely the sort of man nobody ever thought to suspect, which was, of course, exactly why such men so often escaped suspicion for so very long. She spent the Wednesday morning in the small back room where Len Harmon kept the parish registers, cross-referring dates with a patience that would have exhausted a younger woman. What she sought, she found, a record 31 years old of a private arrangement made through Petherbridge and Sons, for old Mr. Petherbridge's father had held the practice before him, placing an infant with a childless couple named Hale, newly arrived from the north of England. It was, on its own, no more than a small dry entry in a dusty ledger, but set beside everything else Miss Marple had gathered, it fell into place with the satisfying click of the final piece of a puzzle long assembled. She confirmed the rest that same afternoon with a telephone call to Ashcroft and Fenn's London office, where the missing solicitor's clerk, considerably relieved, informed her that Mr. Ashcroft himself had that very morning stumbled, dazed and confused, into a farmhouse some 3 miles from where his motor car had been found, having been struck on the head and left in a ditch, his memory of the attack still hazy, but one detail sharp and certain. His assailant had approached his car on the Much Benham Road that afternoon in the guise of a fellow professional man offering assistance with what appeared to be car trouble, and had struck him down the moment he stepped out to investigate. A man, Ashcroft was now quite certain, whom he recognized, from a single prior meeting some weeks before, as the Colonel's own local solicitor. The final confirmation came from Dr. Hale himself, whom Miss Marple visited that evening, with a directness she judged by now to be more useful than tact. "I think, Dr. Hale," she said, seating herself without waiting to be asked, "that you are Delia Fenwick's son, given up for adoption 30 years ago through the offices of Petherbridge and Sons, and raised in the north of England under the name of Hale. I think the Colonel discovered this some weeks before his death, quite by chance, when he happened to mention his own old history to Mr. Petherbridge, not realizing the solicitor had handled the very adoption in question a generation before, and that Petherbridge, in turn, recognized in the description enough to guess at your own true parentage. I think you yourself learned the truth only very recently, and that you have been afraid, ever since the Colonel died, that suspicion would fall upon you, the newly discovered and financially interested son, and that this is why you were so hasty to certify a natural death, and so reluctant, afterward, to admit your doubts." Dr. Hale, very pale, did not attempt to deny it. "Petherbridge told me himself," he said quietly, "the day after the Colonel died, came to my surgery, very grave and sympathetic, and informed me of my true parentage as though he were doing me the greatest kindness in the world. He said the colonel had meant to provide for me handsomely in his new will, and that it would be a tragedy if the whole business came out publicly before matters were properly settled, dragging my mother's name and my own professional reputation through a scandal 30 years old. He suggested, very delicately, that it would be best for everyone if I simply certified natural causes and let the matter rest. I was so thrown by the revelation of my own history, Miss Marple, that I did not think, at the time, to ask myself why a man in Petherbridge's position should be so very anxious that no inquiry be made at all. Because, said Miss Marple gently, Mr. Petherbridge's father, and very possibly Mr. Petherbridge himself, diverted a considerable sum of trust money that ought by rights to have gone toward your maintenance and education 30 years ago. Money the colonel had settled upon you at birth, believing it would follow you into your adoptive family, and which never fully arrived. I think the colonel's new will, and Mr. Ashcroft's proper legal inquiry into the old arrangement, would have exposed that fraud within a very few weeks, at the cost of Mr. Petherbridge's whole reputation, and quite possibly his liberty. I think that is why the colonel had to die before Mr. Ashcroft ever reached Rosemount, and why Mr. Ashcroft himself had to be silenced upon the road, before he could deliver the will that would have brought the whole matter into the light. Dr. Hale sat in stricken silence for a long moment. "What must I do?" he asked at last. "You must come with me tomorrow afternoon," said Miss Marple, "to a small tea party I intend to hold at Rosemount, and you must be prepared, Dr. Hale, to meet, for the first time in your life, your own mother." Chapter 11. The trap is set. Miss Marple's invitation, delivered by hand that same evening, gave no hint of anything so dramatic as an accusation of murder. It requested, mildly, the pleasure of their company at Rosemount the following afternoon, to discuss certain matters arising from the colonel's estate, and asked that tea be laid, as a courtesy to the dead man's memory, at the very table beneath the cedar tree. Inspector Curtis of the county police, summoned by Miss Marple, with rather more explanation than she had offered anyone else, arrived early and installed himself, at her particular request, within the shrubbery beyond the garden wall, well out of sight, but well within hearing, together with 2 constables and a notebook. "I confess, Miss Marple," he said, not for the first time, "I should feel a good deal happier arresting Mr. Petherbridge on the evidence we have already, rather than staging what amounts to a theatrical performance in a dead man's garden." "The evidence we have already," Miss Marple said placidly, "is circumstantial, Inspector, and Mr. Petherbridge is a clever man who has spent 40 years persuading juries of far cleverer arguments than any he need trouble himself with here. I think it very much better that he should convict himself out of his own mouth before witnesses who cannot afterward be accused of malice or misunderstanding. Besides," she added, with a small private smile, "I do not think Mr. Petherbridge will be able to help himself, once he understands quite how much is known." They gathered at 3:30. Gerald Pemberton arrived down from London that morning at Miss Marple's telegraphed request. Vivian Carrow and Thomas Reeve, sitting rather closer together than strict decorum required. Dr. Hale, pale and silent. Mrs. Fenwick, veiled and trembling, seated a little apart from the others. And last to arrive, Mr. Petherbridge himself, immaculate in his dark solicitor's coat, offering his condolences and his professional assistance to the assembled company with every appearance of unruffled calm. "I understand there are matters of the estate to discuss," he said, taking the chair Miss Marple indicated, the very chair, though he could not have known it, in which the colonel had died. "Though I confess I'm a little puzzled why Miss Marple, rather than myself, should be conducting the proceedings." "Because, Mr. Petherbridge," said Miss Marple, pouring tea with perfectly steady hands, "I do not believe the colonel died of a natural heart attack at all. I believe he was poisoned with digitalis, extracted from foxglove, administered in the milk that stood upon this very table, so that when he drank his own tea while waiting for his guests, he collapsed and died before ever they could arrive. I believe the same person who poisoned him drove out along the Much Benham Road that afternoon, waylaid Mr. Ashcroft's motor car under pretence of assistance, struck him down, and stole from his briefcase the very will that would have exposed a fraud committed against a helpless infant more than 30 years ago. A profound silence fell over the little garden. Gerald Pemberton half rose from his chair. Mrs. Carrow's hand flew to her mouth. "A remarkable theory," said Mr. Petherbridge, his voice perfectly level, "though I fail to see what bearing it has upon me in particular, beyond my professional connection to the family." "Because you alone, Mr. Petherbridge, out of everyone at this table, have known the whole history from the very beginning," Miss Marple said, her mild voice carrying, none the less, into every corner of the silent garden. "Your father's firm arranged the private adoption of Delia Ashworth's child 31 years ago. I have seen the parish record myself, this very week. Your father's firm was entrusted with a sum of money the Colonel settled upon that child at birth, a sum which never fully reached the Hale family, who raised him. I think you have known for years precisely what became of that money, Mr. Petherbridge, because I think you have spent a very great deal of it yourself, quietly, over a very long career, confident that no one would ever think to look closely at accounts 30 years old, kept by a man everyone in this district trusted absolutely." "This is slander, Miss Marple, and actionable slander at that," said Petherbridge, though a fine sheen of sweat had appeared upon his forehead, despite the coolness of the afternoon. "When the Colonel discovered, quite by accident, that Dr. Hale, his own local doctor, a man he had known and trusted for 4 years, was in fact the very son he and Delia had given up, he came to you, his solicitor of 20 years, in great excitement, to discuss the proper legal arrangements for acknowledging him. It was you, Mr. Petherbridge, who realized at once that any careful inquiry into that old adoption, any proper legal accounting of the trust the Colonel had settled upon his son, would expose what your father began, and you yourself continued for years afterward. You could not let Mr. Ashcroft ever reach this garden with a properly witnessed will, and you could not let the Colonel live to discuss the matter with anyone else." Dr. Hale had gone very white, staring at the solicitor with an expression of dawning, horrified comprehension. Petherbridge rose abruptly from his chair, his composure, at last, entirely gone. "You cannot prove a word of it," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "I think Mr. Ashcroft, when he is well enough to give his statement properly, will identify you as the man who struck him down upon the Much Benham Road," said Miss Marple, quite unmoved. "I think a proper audit of your firm's accounts, which I understand Inspector Curtis has already applied to the Law Society to authorize, will show a very great many discrepancies stretching back a great many years. And I think, Mr. Petherbridge, that the rose you cut from Mrs. Fenwick's garden 2 nights ago, and left as a kind of cruel signature beside the Colonel's chair on the day he died, will be found to match, exactly, the very particular and rather rare variety that grows nowhere else in this district but her own front garden, a small, foolish, sentimental gesture, for so careful a man, and I rather think it will prove to be the thread that unravels the whole of it." Chapter 12. Death at the Empty Tea Table Revealed. For a moment, that seemed to stretch far longer than its true few seconds, Mr. Petherbridge stood entirely still beside the tea table, his face working through calculation, fury, and something very like despair. Then, with the swiftness of a man who had, perhaps, always known this day might come, and had never quite permitted himself to plan for it, he turned and made a dash for the garden gate. He did not get far. Inspector Curtis and his constables emerged from the shrubbery with the unhurried efficiency of men expecting precisely this outcome, and Mr. Petherbridge, solicitor of 20 years' standing and trusted confidant of half the parish, was taken into custody in the very garden where his victim had died, protesting his innocence in a voice that convinced no one, least of all himself. "It was the money," he said at last, when the fight had gone out of him, and he stood, grey-faced, between the two constables. "My father began it, small sums at first, borrowed against the trust, and never quite repaid, and I continued it, because it had become, by the time I inherited the practice, so thoroughly woven into 40 years of accounts, that unpicking it would have ruined me as surely as exposing it. I never meant murder when it began. I meant only to keep an old and comfortable arrangement quiet a little longer. But Hugh Pemberton would not let well alone, and Ashcroft would not be delayed by anything so simple as excuses, and I found myself, before I had properly decided anything at all, doing what could not afterward be undone." He said no more of substance, then or at his trial some months later, save to confirm, in a flat, exhausted voice, every particular Miss Marple had already laid before them, the digitalis obtained from his own foxgloves and added to the milk jug that morning under pretext of a friendly call, the ambush upon the Much Benham Road, improvised once he learned Ashcroft meant to bring the will directly to Rosemount, and the rose, cut in a fit of bitter spite from Mrs. Fenwick's garden weeks before, when he had gone to warn her, unsuccessfully, to abandon hope of reunion with the son she had lost, and had come away with a single stolen bloom, left on the day of the murder as a message he could never afterward properly explain even to himself. The garden at Rosemount, in the golden hush that followed the inspector's departure, held for a little while a silence of a very different kind. The silence of people who have just watched 30 years of buried grief come, at last, into the light. It was Mrs. Fenwick who broke it, rising from her chair and crossing, with visible difficulty, to where Dr. Hale stood exactly where he had been standing throughout the whole revelation, as though rooted to the spot. Edmund, she said, for that, it transpired, had been the name she had chosen for him, all those years ago, before he was taken from her. I have looked at every young man's face in 3 villages for 30 years, wondering if it might be yours. I never imagined I should find you treating my rheumatism. What passed between them after that belonged to no one but themselves. And Miss Marple, with the particular tact she reserved for such moments, turned her attention instead to Gerald Pemberton, who was regarding the scene with an expression considerably softened from the bitter young man she had first met at the Blue Boar. "I suppose," he said, "I ought to feel cheated, learning my uncle meant to give away a good portion of what I'd always thought of, however resentfully, as mine by right. I find, rather to my own surprise, that I don't." He tried, at the last, to put right a wrong he'd carried 30 years, and I think, if I'm honest, I'd rather have an uncle who did that, even at my expense, than one who never troubled his conscience about anything at all. "He left instructions with Mr. Ashcroft, before he died," Miss Marple said gently, "that the Hampshire matter should be settled fairly between yourself and Dr. Hale, once he was found, whatever else the new will contained. I understand from Mr. Ashcroft, who telephoned me only this morning, that the document survived his ordeal on the Much Benham Road rather better than he did himself, tucked as it was, in an inner pocket, the thief in his haste never thought to search. As for Vivienne Carrow and Thomas Reeve, no further objection from beyond the grave remained to trouble their engagement, and the banns were read at St. Mary Mead Church within the month, a piece of news that gave Mrs. Price at the post office a full fortnight's satisfying conversation, and which Miss Marple, walking home from the service with her basket over her arm, found herself reflecting upon with a quiet and entirely personal contentment. "You know, Griselda," she said to Mrs. Harmon, as they walked together beneath the lime trees that lined the lane to the vicarage, I have thought a great deal these past weeks about that empty tea table, 3 cups laid, and only one ever filled. I believe the Colonel meant it that afternoon as a table set for reconciliation. Himself, the son he had wronged, and the woman he had never stopped loving, gathered together at last, after 30 years of silence. It is very sad that he did not live to see it filled, but I think in the end it was filled after all, only a little later than he had planned, and in a garden he never got to see. You make it sound almost a comfort, Jane. I think it is one, said Miss Marple, of a very particular and English kind. The kind that comes in the end not from forgetting what was lost, but from setting it right, however late the hour. Colonel Pemberton set his table for 3, all those weeks ago, hoping for a happiness he had denied himself and others for 30 years. It seems to me a fitting thing that his death, sad as it was, should be the very means by which that happiness was, after all, delivered. She paused at the vicarage gate, looking back down the lane toward Rosemount, its garden now quiet once more beneath the cedar tree. There is a great deal of human nature in a village like ours, Griselda. More, I sometimes think, than in all the great cities of the world put together, if only one takes the trouble to look closely enough, and to remember that the sweetest seeming roses very often grow above the deepest roots. And with that, Miss Jane Marple continued on her way toward tea and knitting, leaving St. Mary Mead to settle, as it always did, back into its ordinary and watchful calm.